Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is Liz Stanton. I'm the Director and Senior Economist at the Applied Economics Clinic, and it is my pleasure today to act as moderator for IEEFA's online session on the financial risks of carbon capture for coal-fired power plants. David Schlissel is our presenter today, and David is IEEFA's Director of Resource Planning Analysis and is part of IEEFA's carbon capture team. IEEFA's reports and analysis on carbon capture are available on the IEEFA website. David also wanted me to let you know that his slides for this presentation will be available on IEEFA's website, and that if you have any lingering questions after the session is over, he'd be very happy to answer those for you on email. Let's talk about the logistics of how this works. In a moment, we'll turn to David's presentation on carbon capture. And after that, we'll return to a question and answer session with me and David. And here's how that will work. You will be writing your questions into SwapCard, and I will take them from there and ask them to David and get answers for you. Here are the specifics on how to do that. So if you have any questions for David, on the right-hand side of the live feed, there's a chat box with 3 tabs. The first tab is a live discussion where you can share your opinions and reactions to the session with other audience members. On the second tab, you'll find a live Q&A, and you use this to ask a question that you want to get an answer to. And if someone else has asked a question that you like, you can click the thumbs up, and that question will be pushed to the top of the list. So I'll be paying attention to that list of questions and seeing what new questions come in and also which ones have lots of thumbs ups. And I'll be passing those questions along to David and we'll hear his answers. So with no further ado, let's get started with David's presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Good afternoon. Welcome to IEEFA's observations on carbon capture at coal-fired power plants. These observations are based on our work over the last 2 to 3 years, analyzing a number of proposed carbon capture retrofits at existing coal plants in the U.S. and reviewing the available literature on carbon capture. I just want to note that when I say our, I mean the work of the 3 of us on the IEEFA carbon capture team. Myself, Dennis Wamstead, and Carl Cates. You can go to the IEEFA website to see some of the work we have produced on carbon capture so far, and there is more in the pipeline that will come out in the coming months. As shown on my slide 2, there are currently 2 operating coal plants that capture some of the CO2 they produce. These are the Boundary Dam Unit 3 coal plant in Saskatchewan, Canada, and Petra Nova, a project near Houston, Texas. Boundary Dam went into service. Boundary Dam's carbon capture facility went online in October of 2014. Petra Nova went into service in early 2017. There are 7 or possibly 8, depending on how you counted them, proposed carbon capture projects around the U.S., as you can see from the map on slide 2. Our work has led us to 3 overall conclusions on carbon capture. The first is that capturing CO2 from existing coal plants is uneconomic, and the market in the U.S. for doing so, already limited, is shrinking fast. The second conclusion is that retrofitting existing coal-fired power plants for carbon capture will prolong the operating lives of some units. Instead of capturing CO2 from aging and uneconomic coal plants, the same money would be better spent on developing new renewable resources and on energy efficiency, and thereby not produce the CO2 in the first place. Our third conclusion is that continuing to do research on capturing CO2 from non-coal sources is very important, including capturing the CO2 from gas-fired power plants, industrial sources, as well as direct air capture. Analyzing the financial viability of proposed carbon capture projects involves examining a range of factors, the most important of which are listed on my slide 4. Of these, the four most important are the initial capital or construction cost of the retrofit, how much CO2 will the retrofitted plant produce, how much of the CO2 that it produces will be captured, and 4, what will it cost to generate electricity at the plant after it is retrofitted for carbon capture. The proponents of carbon capture focus on the first 3 of these factors, but ignore the issue of what will be the price of the electricity from the plant after it's retrofitted. Instead, they simply dismiss this as an issue by saying incorrectly and untruthfully that these plants are low-cost generators. In many cases that we've looked at, the answer is they are not. And as I will show later in this presentation, retrofitting for carbon capture is likely to make the cost of electricity from a coal plant much more expensive. Now, looking at slide 5, you can see that the federal government has spent well over $100 million in the past couple of years to support site-specific analyses on what are called front-end engineering design or FEED studies for proposed retrofits. In addition, the 2018 Federal Tax Act provides what could ultimately be many billions of dollars of tax credits for the developers and investors in carbon capture retrofits. For example, the Act provides for a tax credit that are called 45 capital Q credits of $35 for each metric ton of CO2 that is captured from a coal plant and used for what's called enhanced oil recovery, or in shorthand, EOR. And the same act provides for $50 a ton federal tax credit for CO2 that is captured and then permanently stored or sequestered in a secure geologic underground formation. However, our project-specific economic and financial analyses show that even these billions of dollars of subsidies will not be adequate, 1, to cover the full cost of retrofitting coal plants with carbon capture, 2, to protect investors from the full range of risks associated with retrofitting and then operating coal plants after they are retrofitted for carbon capture, and 3, will not protect ratepayers against the risk of having to pay higher electricity rates because of retrofits. Slide 6 shows that there is only a very limited market in the U.S. for carbon capture retrofits, and that market is shrinking rapidly. As you see on the left side of slide 6, the percentage of electricity produced from coal in the U.S. has declined from 50% in 2010 to about 20% in 2020 and is expected to drop to 11% by sometime between 2024 and 2030. At the same time, on the right side of slide 6, you can see that the average coal plant capacity factor has declined substantially over this period. Now, a plant's capacity factor measures how much it actually produces in electricity compared to what it would have produced if it had operated at full power for 100% of the hours in the period. The higher the capacity factor, the more electricity the plant produces. The lower the capacity factor, the lower the amount of electricity it produces. And obviously a higher capacity factor is better for the plant. But as slide 6 shows, that's not been happening, and we expect over the future years that coal plant capacity factors will continue to decline, and that many additional coal plants will be retired as their owners decide that continuing to operate the plants are uneconomic, and also that there are cheaper alternatives, renewables, natural gas in particular. Now, as I noted earlier, one of the major factors affecting the financial viability of a proposed carbon capture retrofit is its capital or construction cost. Proponents of carbon capture claim that the capital cost of retrofitting existing coal plants is going to decline dramatically in coming years. Although it is reasonable to expect that there will be some decline in capital costs over time, and I have to emphasize over time, as more plants are built and operated, lessons will be learned and projects can be expected to grow in size and number. However, the dramatic declines projected by proponents of carbon capture are simply not realistic. The cost of retrofitting them will not decline this sharply or this quickly. If you look at slide 8, you can see on the left how the projected costs of proposed carbon capture retrofits compares to the actual cost that was incurred retrofitting or building the Petra Nova project in Texas. The proponents of new plants some of them project that the cost of a new plant will be 72% less expensive than the actual cost of Petra Nova. We don't expect that to happen. In fact, scaling up new technologies, which is what we're talking about here, almost always leads to unanticipated problems and additional costs, both during construction and operation. If you look at my slide 9, this is especially true for two economically disastrous projects. The Edwardsport, its integrated gasification combined cycle project, IGCC plant in Indiana, and the Kemper IGCC plant in Mississippi. IGCC just refers to the fact that these plants were expected to take coal, gasify it, make it into a gas, take the CO2 out, at least in the Kemper case, and then burn the natural gas. Both of the plants, as you can see from slide 9, the actual costs were dramatically higher than the proponents projected. Same thing has happened with new nuclear plants. The cost of the 2 new nuclear units at the Vogtle plant in Georgia has skyrocketed, and they're not even finished yet. The second major factor in determining the financial viability of a proposed retrofit is how much CO2 will be captured. Capturing 90% of the CO2 produced in a coal plant is the holy grail of carbon capture. Although proponents of carbon capture claim that the technology for 90% capture has been proven or demonstrated at the existing Boundary Dam and Petra Nova projects, the reality is neither one has produced any evidence to support this claim. Indeed, the limited data that is publicly available suggests that neither has achieved the capture of 90% of the CO2 it produces on a consistent basis. In fact, as you look at slide 10, you can see that both projects, Boundary Dam Unit 3 and Petra Nova, have actually captured less CO2 than their owners projected they would when they went into service. Now, we've performed an analysis of Petra Nova based on available public information, and it appears that the project has captured somewhere between 80 and 82% of the CO2, not 90%. And Boundary Dam appears to have captured much less than that. Part of the problem is that the owners, in particular Petra Nova, haven't produced any data to justify their claim that the project is actually capturing 90% of the CO2. The owners also haven't produced any actual data on what it's costing to capture CO2, or whether the project has experienced any unanticipated technical and operating problems since it went into service in early January of 2017. Instead of producing this evidence, they just want everyone to accept that everything has gone great at the project. Now, if it was me and my project, everything went great, I'd be showing off all the data I could to prove it to people. Obviously, they don't think that's necessary, or else it's not true that the plant's operated well. Also, the third factor in affecting the financial viability of a project is that retrofitted coal plants are unlikely to produce enough CO2 to make them financially viable. See, first they have to produce the CO2 and then they have to capture as much of it as they can. For example, the two remaining units at the San Juan generating station in northwest New Mexico have achieved only a 70% average capacity factor over the past decade and only an average 63% capacity factor in the past 2 years. As I mentioned, the higher the capacity factor, the better. Now, the proponents of retrofitting San Juan claim that miraculously, once the units are retrofitted for carbon capture, instead of achieving a 63% capacity factor or a 70% capacity factor, they will, as I say, miraculously achieve an average 85% capacity factor every year. But there's no evidence to support this, and it's patently absurd to expect that an older coal plant its performance will increase this much. Actually, you would expect that as coal plants age, their performance will decline. Also, as shown in Figure 12, the reason why having a higher capacity is important is because having a lower capacity means that the plant will produce less CO2, which in turn means it will be eligible for far fewer 45Q federal tax credits. This makes the project far less financially viable and significantly increases the risk for investors. Indeed, we expect that instead of increasing after being retrofitted for carbon capture, San Juan's capacity factors will continue to decline due to the continued availability of low-cost natural gas in the Southwest, increased competition from declining cost renewables, and also increasing integration of the Western U.S. grid. In essence, San Juan will have to compete with ever-increasing amounts of solar power coming out of California in particular. Finally, as shown on slide 13, retrofitting a coal plant for carbon capture will lead to higher, perhaps much higher electricity prices for ratepayers. As you can see on the left side of slide 13, the net output of a coal plant will decline after being retrofitted for carbon capture. That's because the carbon capture equipment requires a substantial amount of the gross output, the total power that's produced by the plant, for operating. This means that while the gross output of the plant, as you can see on the left side of slide 13, remains the same, more of it is consumed by running the internal equipment, including the carbon capture equipment, and less power is available for ratepayers or to be sold into the market. This means that the cost per megawatt hour will go up. Now, on the right side of slide 13, you can see that we have done a hypothetical illustration of what would have happened if San Juan had been retrofitted prior to 2019. In that case, the cost would have increased from the actual average price of $44.90 per megawatt hour to $63.29. Either of these, with or without carbon capture, would have been much higher than the cost of buying power from solar projects. Recent solar power purchase agreements in New Mexico have had prices of $15 per megawatt hour just for solar electricity and $30.37 per megawatt hour for a project that would have solar electricity plus storage capability. Finally, it would have been cheaper in both cases, in actual reality, or if in the hypothetical that the plant had been retrofitted prior to 2019, would have been cheaper to just buy power from the wholesale market at one of the hubs in Arizona. If you have any questions about what I've discussed, please fire away now, or else contact Dennis, Carl, or me after the presentation. Thank you.